Welcome. This video covers R Markdown. We are at the point in the course where we now have a pretty reasonable idea about how R works, right? We have objects, we have functions. We know a lot about how R stores the common types of data that we'll see. So we have vectors, lists, data frames. We can bring in raw data as long as it's in a nice format. And so now we're ready to talk about, well, I have my data in R. What do I do with my data? What can I do? What can I create? And so we want to talk about the ideas of manipulating data next. What we mean by manipulating data is we want to maybe subset rows or columns. So maybe we want to remove some of the observations that we don't want to analyze. Maybe we want to add a new variable or add a new column to my data set. Maybe we just want to remove some of the outliers or some of the weird data points that were maybe input errors. But when we start thinking about this idea of manipulating our data, we want to make sure that we consider the idea of making sure that everything is reproducible. So whatever end data set we get to, we want to make sure that the entire process from when we read that data in to that final data set that we get that we want to analyze and summarize, that entire process can be redone so that we can get the same exact results if we did it again. And so we talked about the idea of using like an R script with comments in it to sort of document the entire process of what we're doing. And that's fine. That's sort of the traditional way of doing coding. But R has a package called R Markdown, which allows you to actually create code with text and formatting and images, and then you can create these lovely final documents like an HTML document, a PDF document, a slideshow, and things like that. In fact, all the notes that we're looking at here were created using R Markdown. And if you've never used an R Markdown or a Markdown language before, like Jupyter Notebooks, for instance, if you've never used something like that, once you start to see Markdown and how powerful it is, you'll never go back to programming with scripts. So let's just look at a quick example of an R Markdown document that is the end product. So this document here was written completely within R, and this is just a quick analysis that recreated some things that was in an article from the journal Nature, I believe. So we had we have like a header up top here. We have another header for a section header here. We have some links. We have an image being brought in. And then down here we have R code that's actually being evaluated and the output being shown from what gets evaluated. Then we have some more plain text that's been formatted into headings. We have more R code that gets evaluated. We're creating a new variable here, and then we're summarizing it. And so you can just see how this document takes into account the plain text that you might write that would document your process and tell you what you were thinking, the code that you're writing, and the output all in one place. And so this is a really, really powerful thing that you can use and really improve your workflow and make yourself much more efficient. All right, so what is this Markdown stuff that I'm talking about? What's it used for? Well, according to the book R for Data Science, which is written by Hadley Wickham, it's meant for communicating to decision makers. So there's a very easy way to sort of hide all of your code when you produce your final document. So you just show like your plots, your analyses, your tables, those kinds of things. It can also be used for collaborating with other data scientists, including you in the future. So you can just put your entire thought process down, include the code, include the output, everything like that. But more generally, it's just often used as a way to do data science. So you can program within your R Markdown document, within RStudio. You can run your code there before you sort of create your final documents. So you can go through iterations of the code that you want before you try to produce, say, a PDF or something like that as your final document. All right, so what is Markdown? What is that language? What's that syntax, that verbiage all about? Well, most people have heard of HTML, right? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, which really just means that you're writing plain text and you're surrounding them with these tags, like an A tag is an anchor tag for a link, those kinds of things. And so what web browsers do, like Chrome or Firefox or whatever, those actually take that plain text and they determine how to render that stuff so that you see nicer looking web pages. Well, R Markdown is a specific markup language, which means that you're still just going to be writing plain text. You're just going to be putting different formatting symbols within there. And so it has a lot easier syntax than something like HTML. But since it's an easier syntax, generally speaking, you can't do quite as much easily. You can actually write HTML code, though, within Markdown, which is really nice, as long as you're producing an HTML document at the end. And so any plain text file that you write can be used as a Markdown as an R Markdown document. However, if you use a .rmd extension, this is going to associate that file with RStudio. And so if you double click on it, for instance, it will open in RStudio, and then RStudio will know it's a Markdown document and give you different menus than you see when you're working with an R script. All right, and what's really nice about these Markdown files is that they go through a process. This is the file you write, the file you actually code in. So you code in there, you write your thought processes, all that kind of stuff in there. And then what you do is you knit that document. So you choose to knit. And whenever you knit, we're going to use that phrase a lot, we're going to knit the document. Whenever we click our button or we run our code that says take this RMD document and create something that's an output document, the process it goes through is it actually creates a regular Markdown document, a specific flavor of Markdown, and then it goes through a program called Pandoc, and Pandoc is actually the software that can make a PDF, it can make an HTML, it can make slideshows, you can make Word documents, PowerPoint documents, all sorts of fun stuff. But that's going to be our process. We're going to write our RMD file, we're going to write our code and our thought process in there. We'll knit it to the appropriate type of output. So what goes into a .rmd file? What goes into one of our Markdown files? Well, there are three major types of content. One is a YAML header. So this is, YAML's ain't another Markdown language, something silly like that. But this is the thing at the top of the document that's essentially like your header. It's going to describe metadata about your document. So things like the author, the title, what kind of document you want to create as the end product. So that usually goes at the top of your file. And then within your file itself, you have things that are chunks of R code that are going to evaluate and possibly produce output. And you also just have sort of regular text that's mixed with formatting so that you'll get things like titles, section headers, links, and those types of things. And RStudio is wonderful because it gives you template documents. So it makes it really easy to get started with Markdown. You just go to File, New File, and click on R Markdown. And when you do that, you're going to see lots of different options for a sort of default type of output that you're going to create. So for instance, under this document tab on the left, you can say, I want to create an HTML document as my final product, or a PDF, or a Word document. And really, all you're doing with this menu is just setting some of the settings for your YAML header. So RStudio is essentially just saying, I'm going to set up the YAML header for you so that the metadata is defined about this document. And so that YAML header that gets set up at the top, whenever you use the knit button, which we're going to look at in just a second, or you use the hotkeys of Control-Shift-K or Command-Shift-K, the information within that header is what's going to be used to knit the document. So whatever it says up here for the output, for instance, this is the type of output file that's going to be created when you knit just sort of by default. There'll be ways to use a menu to knit and override what's in the YAML header, and you can also use R code to overwrite what's in the YAML header as well. Okay, so you got your YAML header, and then you're going to have some plain text within your document that you can put formatting instructions around. So what are some of the common formatting instructions that you're going to see? Well, a pound sign actually creates what's called a header. And so a single pound sign will give you a first level header. If you put 2 pound signs, that'll give you a second level header. And this will go all the way down to 6 levels. And what's nice about using these things is that you can easily create a table of contents with these. So you can easily create a table of contents using these headers. Other things that you might see would be, here's the simple formatting that you would do to create a link in R Markdown. So you just put carets around this, so a less than and a greater than sign. You can also do links that don't look like a URL. So for instance, this is Markdown code to create a link to the cheat sheet that gives you lots more information about the types of Markdown syntax that you might need to learn. And so that's a good place to go as you start to learn this. Just have that cheat sheet at the ready. Other things that you're going to see, putting 2 stars or 2 underscores next to a word, around a word, will make that thing bold. You'll see things like a single star or underscore, and that's going to make things italic. And then you can combine those to get bold and italic words. And you can do things like simple lists. So you can use most any symbols like a dash or a plus or a star, and you can create ordered lists. If you use numbers and letters, you can create, this is an unordered list. You can use numbers and letters and create an ordered list as well. Now you do have to be careful. I mentioned previously that we oftentimes want to show our white space characters when we're doing our Markdown, and that's because whenever you're indenting your sublists, you need to do very specific things like indent them 4 spaces to make sure that they're indented appropriately. So this is 4 spaces right here. All right, besides this syntax that you're going to have around your sort of plain text, we're also going to have lots of code chunks. So a code chunk within your .rmd file looks something like this. So you can see that there are backticks up here at the top, and then there's a curly bracket, and then R. So this is saying, I want to call some R code. Within here, you're going to give it options on the code chunk. And then any R code can go within the code chunk. And code chunks will evaluate sequentially whenever you create or whenever you actually knit your RMD file. So the first code chunk, if it creates some output, you can utilize that in the second code chunk. And you don't have to necessarily type out a code chunk. R Studio gives you a nice shortcut key for doing it. So if you do Control Command plus Alt or Option plus I, you will automatically do sort of the backticks in the R start and finish. So it'll create an empty code chunk for you. And again, when you go to knit the document, these code chunks will evaluate unless you do something like eval equal false as an option, and that's going to say don't actually evaluate this R code whenever we go to render this document. Again, as I mentioned previously, these code chunks are going to evaluate sequentially. So if you want to create something up top, you can utilize the results of that thing down below. And just like I mentioned before, you can specify the behavior of individual code chunks using sort of local options. Or you can also set global chunk behavior. And whenever you create your template document using R Studio, they're going to give you syntax for setting your global chunk options. So see your template document to know how to do that. And, you know, this is one of the great reasons to use R Studio. They try to do as much help as they can give you whenever you're starting to learn either how to code in R or when you're starting to learn how to do Markdown documents or Shiny documents, or Shiny web apps, those kinds of things. So let's talk a little bit more about those code chunk options. Some of the things that you might specify would be whether or not the code that you write actually shows in the final document. And so you can hide or show your code for that final document using the echo option. And again, these things go up here within these curly brackets. So you can put echo equal false or true. You do need to be case sensitive on these things. So echo, lowercase, false or true, all uppercase. Like we have up here, we can choose whether or not the code gets evaluated whenever we knit or render the document. And we can do that via eval. So eval equal true says, yes, please do evaluate this code chunk. Otherwise, you can put it as false. And you can also have code evaluate but not show up and show no output. So this is something that you often want to do at, say, like a beginning code chunk where you're just sort of setting up some of your R environment things, reading in packages and things like that. You can have a setup chunk that you would put include equals true or include equals false. And then, you know, a lot of packages, when you read them in or whenever you run certain functions, they'll send messages to the console. And so sometimes you don't want to display those messages because they just clutter up your final document. And so you can do things like message equal true or false and warning equal true or false to turn things like that off. And then, as I mentioned, you can set your local chunk options for each one of your code chunks, or you can also specify global chunk options. So the default behavior for every code chunk unless you override it with local behavior. And so you do this in usually what's called a setup code chunk at the top of your document. And again, whenever you do your template R Markdown document, they're going to give you some of this code. But this is how you set global chunk options. You need the knit R package read in, and then you say ops underscore chunk $set, and you set the global options here. All right, last thing to talk about before we start jumping into actually using R Markdown would be that you can include inline R code. So R code doesn't just need to go into an R code chunk if you want it to evaluate. You can actually do it within your text that you're writing as well. And so how do you do that? Well, you use a single backtick, an R, to say I want to evaluate R code, and then you put the line of R code that you want to evaluate. And you can do something like backtick length iris length iris 1, and then put a semicolon and put another line of code, and it will evaluate more than one line of code at once. But generally speaking, you usually just want to put one line of code that you would evaluate for inline code. And so this 150 that you actually see here is being rendered from R code. I didn't type 150 myself here. I actually got it from this R code chunk over here. Well, this inline R code over here. Okay. And then we need to know what kind of output documents that we can create and how to do that. And I've mentioned this idea that we're going to be able to knit the document. So that's the process that's the name that we call the process of actually creating our documents. And again, there's going to be that output type defined in the YAML header. And again, that's going to be the default behavior when you knit. And so you can use Control or Command Shift K to knit by that information. Or you can click on this ball of yarn here. So you can click the knit button. Or if you click on this little arrow, you can override what's in the YAML header and say, I want to knit to a PDF or HTML or Word based off of your choice here rather than that YAML header. And then alternatively, if you really want to move into the world of automating the things that you're doing, you can actually use R code to render a file, to knit a file, rather than clicking on menus or using hotkeys. There are lots of different output options. So whenever you say, I want to create an HTML document, there are lots of different outputs that you can put for what that final HTML document will look like. And remember, we talked about the idea of creating a table of contents with our headers. So we got to use headers for these things. But if we use headers for HTML and PDF documents, we can automatically create tables of contents by putting the appropriate things within the YAML header. And you have to be very careful about the syntax, very careful about the spacing. Whenever you put things in the YAML header, it goes based off of spacing, whether things are options of the above and whatnot. So there's this R Markdown definitive guide here that gives lots of useful information about how we actually need to specify these things and all the other options that you might want to specify. And so there's a link to that available at the end of this presentation, and that's a good book to have whenever you're going to try to learn these things and add different options. Now, if you want to create PDFs and you've never done LaTeX before, you probably do not have what's called a tech engine on your machine that you're working on your computer. And if you don't have a tech engine, then what you need to do is actually install one. But you can actually do that all through RStudio rather than installing it yourself separately. How do you do that? Well, you install the TinyTech package first. The TinyTech package then has a function called install_TinyTech, which will install a very small version of a tech engine for you. So there's a 4-step process here to get you to be able to create PDF documents if you don't have a tech engine already on your computer. If you don't know what a tech engine is, you probably don't have it, and so you'd want to go through this process. All right, let's jump into R and check out R Markdown. All right, here we are in RStudio. Let's go ahead and create a Markdown document. We can go to File, New File, R Markdown, and we can get a nice template document. Again, you can choose lots of different output styles. This is really just going to define what's in your YAML header to start with. You can always change that afterward. I'm just going to leave it as an HTML document right now. And now I get a template document that gives me some of the ideas of the kinds of things I would want to put in here. Again, I've set up that YAML header based off of what I chose there, but you can change it afterwards. So I might change this to first RMD. So this is my first try at running an RMD document. And here's a date. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. I don't like having dates in my document. And you can see here that the first thing they give you after that YAML header is a setup code chunk. And this is actually the name given to this code chunk. It's called setup. And you can see it down here, chunk 1 setup. There's a little menu down here that actually pops up if you click on those arrows, and it allows you to jump to the different code chunks that you're in. And so you can name your code chunks. So for instance, I come down here to code chunk 2, its name is cars. The code chunk 3's name is pressure. I don't like to give names because if you copy your code chunks and then sort of change some of the code, but you don't change the name, it will fail to render your final document. And I do that a decent amount because you can't have 2 code chunks named exactly the same thing. So I just don't use code chunks. And so oftentimes I'll have code chunks in my document like this, and maybe let's say plot iris in here. And so those do still show up down here in your menu. They just don't have a name. But as long as you're using section headers, for instance, we have a # R Markdown. That's a second level header. We have a # including plots, and that's a second level header. That gives you an easy way to jump between your code chunks and have an idea what part of your document you're in. All right, so again, this is a code chunk. That's the name of the code chunk. And then here are the options for this particular code chunk. And you can see that include equal false is placed here. So that means that it's going to evaluate the code, but it's not going to echo. It's not going to show any kinds of messages or warnings. And that's because this is a setup code chunk. We're just really specifying some of the behavior that we want for R, and maybe we're including something like library tidyverse. And by having include equal false, whenever you run library tidyverse, it sends you lots of different messages about reading in packages and some conflicts, things like that. I've actually already read in the tidyverse in this session, so it didn't show those conflicts here. But generally speaking, it would send some messages. Since this is in a code chunk that has include equals false, it's not going to send that to you. And then they give you the information and syntax for how you specify global chunk options down here. So I'm going to say eval equal true. Maybe I'll do message equal false. These are all going to be now my global chunk options. Every subsequent code chunk down here is going to have the behavior specified here unless it's overridden in a local chunk option. But again, this one does not go by these code chunks, so you have to specify it here. All right, below the code chunk that you see here is just some Markdown syntax with plain text. A link, bold font. Pretty easy to do, pretty easy to learn. Again, I'd have that cheat sheet handy. And then, this is just a little bit more information. But one thing that we didn't talk about that's really useful is that you can actually run your code chunks prior to trying to knit your document. So this is actually a good environment for doing your coding as well. You can either send this directly to be evaluated using your hotkeys, or you can press this play button, which will run your current chunk. You can also click on this button and it will run all the chunks above. So again, oftentimes we have chunks above that create our objects, and then we want to access them later. So we can run all the chunks above, it submits them all, and then you can hit this to run this particular code chunk. And so you might say, oh, I don't really like that species column being in there. Maybe I'll go ahead and subset that out using some base R notation. So I'm going to do -5. Let's get rid of that 5th column. And now I'm going to reevaluate that inline. I like that much better. Now I'm going to go ahead and move on to my next bit of coding. So again, this sort of gives you an environment for actually doing your coding, making sure everything works before you try to knit the final document. And so that brings us to knitting, right? Knitting, you can either create your final document by pressing this knit button, or you can see it highlights the hotkeys. If I click on knit here, I do have to save the document for the first time. So I'm going to say first rmd.rmd. And now it's going to open up an R Markdown tab down here and start rendering that file. So it's processing this .rmd file. It's actually running all of the R code chunks. And you can see if you click over here, it's actually creating a .md file first. Go back to there. So it's creating a .md file, which is just a plain Markdown document. And then it's using that to then create the final document. So it's creating a .html as its final document. And so you can see here, this is an HTML document that ran that R code. That setup code chunk was not included up here. You don't see anything from it, but it did execute that code. So that's pretty nice. Pretty great way to do your coding. All right, the last thing to talk about, I think, would be the spacing and some of the things that you might do with your YAML header. So for instance, you might want to add a table of contents, and we saw that we could do that by doing something like this. Let's get rid of this spacing that it automatically made. So now I have output, I have HTML document below that, and TOC true below that. And so you might think, you know what, this should create a table of contents in my HTML document. But R Markdown can be very finicky about spacing, especially in the YAML header. And so when you have it spaced out like this with no spaces before, it's not actually going to render that table of contents appropriately. If I look here at the top where the table of contents should show up, it just says true. And so what we actually need is to have 2 spaces here to drop that HTML document below output, and then 2 spaces, 2 more spaces to get that TOC under HTML document. Again, the best place to learn about how to specify your YAML header options would be that R Markdown definitive guide. They have examples of specifying different options there, and you can usually get the hang of it from seeing a few of those. But now this produces this table of contents I can click around and jump through. You might notice that, again, you can see my white spaces, which is kind of nice. We talked about this previously, but you can go to Tools, Global Options, and then go to the Code tab on the left and Display, and you can do Show White Space Characters. And this is really useful when you're doing this coding with Markdown, because sometimes it does care quite a bit about whether you have spaces at the end of 2 spaces at the end of a paragraph or not. That can change slightly what the outputted document looks like. All right, and lastly, let's just create something that's not an HTML document. So rather than clicking knit or using the hotkeys, I'll use this little arrow and just click knit to PDF. I do have a tech engine on my computer, and so it's going to go ahead and try to create that PDF document based off of that. Looks like you can specify TOC yes rather than true, and it works as well. We can see the same process is done. It evaluates everything. It creates a .md file just like before, but now that .md file is used to create a PDF file instead. And so here it is. Hopefully you're seeing some of this stuff and thinking it's pretty cool. Once you start programming in Markdown and R Markdown, you'll never go back to just writing in a regular R script. This just adds so much functionality, and being able to produce a final document based off of what you're writing just saves you so much time. Again, there's a cheat sheet here for getting started, and then there's the R Markdown definitive guide that can help you understand even more about the different types of outputs you can create, how to specify the options, and things like that.